Frank Lloyd Wright is one of the most intriguing figures of our time, considered by many, including himself, the greatest American architect of the 20th century. This celebrated and notorious American architect, known for his revolutionary designs and tempestuous personal life, is the subject of a new documentary by filmmakers Ken Burns and Lynn Novick. It will air over 2 nights on PBS, November 10th and 11th. Here is a clip from the series.
But through it all, he never stopped dreaming of new ways to build. He was, one of his draftsmen remembered, 200% alive.
I am pleased to have the directors Ken Burns and Lynn Novick here to talk about Frank Lloyd Wright and about the making of this film. Welcome. Great to see you. Great to have you back, my friend.
Thank you.
Bring me to Frank Lloyd Wright and why.
This is history running on all cylinders. This is a guy who lives the American century, right? He's born 2 years after Appomattox. He dies 2 years after Sputnik. He is the prototypical American in every way. He's got a second act, which people have been saying we don't have. He has a third act. It's so terrific.
No second acts in America, it was said.
Yeah, but and we definitely have them all the time, particularly now. And Frank Lloyd Wright sort of invented his second acts. He's also the greatest American architect, without a doubt. His overweening ego notwithstanding, that is true. The legacy of the buildings are great. This roller coaster of a personal life makes the biography so interesting. And in the end, he is asking us not just to live and like his houses the way an artist might want you to like his paintings. He's asking you to rethink what a house is and how we live. Architecture is the most important art because it's working on us all the time. And we don't choose to go to it. It's there with us all the time. It's not like the ballet or the theater or the cinema or television. It's working on us now. And he's the only person I know who every moment of his life insisted that we wake up and that he was going to provide the tangible evidence of how we might rearrange our lives to live better and more organically.
What is it you, after such study, found most interesting and fascinating about him?
Well, for me, I think it was the process of constant revelation of going into every different, unique Frank Lloyd Wright space. It's something we struggled with in terms of making the film, how to convey what it's like to be in these extraordinary places, the Guggenheim, the Unity Temple, some of the homes. And the fact is that you can never imagine, you can't anticipate what it's going to feel like. And when you even look at the outside of a building, you can't see what's inside, and it's always not what you expect. And then the sense of actually being in these buildings for an extended period of time, not just a quick tour with a tour guide, but basically living in a space for a day or two, the way we did when we were filming. It made me begin to feel something of his presence and his genius and try to make a connection with who he was and how he thought about things in a way that's kind of hard to explain, but I feel like it sort of worked on me to the point that now when people ask me what's the lesson of the film and what's important about Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture, I think what he's saying is that we have to expect more of our architecture. It can't just be a purely functional utilitarian space. It has to be something that gives us the possibility of something more, something higher, if you will.
Before we go any further, here is Frank Lloyd Wright himself talking about himself and his architecture in an interview with Mike Wallace. Take a look.
I understand that last week, in all seriousness, you said, if I had another 15 years to work, I could rebuild this entire country. I could change the nation.
I did say that, and it's true. Having had now the experience going with the building of 769 buildings, it's quite easy for me to shake them out of my sleeve, and it's amazing what I could do for this country. I've been accused of saying I was the greatest architect in the world, and if I had said so, I don't think it would be very arrogant.
He looked the part.
He did.
I mean, the cape, the whole damn thing.
He acted it out. It was his whole, from the very beginning, he conceived of himself as a public figure. And he knew that he had to play a part to get clients and to get attention. And he consciously affected a cape, cane, certain kind of hat, and a posture,
flowing,
basically. A certain kind of haircut that was very unusual for the time. And whenever he walked into a room, heads turned, even though he was only 5'6".
Did he find success early in his life? Was he early on known to be
He was driven.
The stuff of greatness.
His mama pushed him, and he hooked himself up with Louis Sullivan, the greatest architect. He then moonlighted.
And Sullivan fired his...
Sullivan got rid of him. He started his own practice and basically revolutionized architecture with the prairie style, which just changed the dimensions of what a house was about, particularly in the suburbs around Chicago that were going up. And he saw himself as the guy who was going to transform architecture. So very early on, he is at the top of his field within the Midwest, within the Chicago area.
Do you have one favorite Frank Lloyd Wright building, object?
Well, you know, there's a thing.
Was it Falling Water? What was it turned you on?
Well, there's lots of different things. The thing that you're drawn to is that his buildings are simultaneously monumental and intimate. And I've never seen that in any other building. You go into the Guggenheim, you've seen the pictures, and you go in, and your first impression is, wow, it's smaller than I thought. You take 2 steps, and you go, it's huge. There's a kind of intentionality in his gestures that are great, and they're there in every building. From the private houses, the textile houses in California are great. 4 or 5 houses he did there in the 1920s. But for me, there's nothing more sublime than walking into the Johnson Wax Building in Racine, Wisconsin, which is essentially an office space. It is a cathedral, a temple. It wakes you up. It is, Philip Johnson in our film says it may be the greatest space in America, and I have to agree to him. When I walked into there, my heart sang. It leapt, and I've never had a building do that in exactly that same way, where it wasn't just that you were looking at a great art the way you might admire the brushstrokes in a Rembrandt, but like a Rembrandt, it was asking you questions about yourself. It was demanding something of you, something, as Lynn said, higher. And there can be no greater human purpose to art than that.
Even more so than Jefferson's University of Virginia?
Well, I think so, very much so. I mean, Jefferson was limited, I think, in an intellectual way. He's always, in his letters, arguing between the head and the heart. I don't think Frank Lloyd Wright argued between the head and the heart. If the heart told him go this way, he went that way. If the head told him go that way, he did that. And that's the great thing. So what he left you with is this idea that the purpose of the architect was to take nature, feed it through the soul, and make something that was more natural than nature itself. And our consultant, William Cronin, said, that's as close as you get to God. And suddenly, Frank Lloyd Wright, in almost everything he's building, is reminding you what our human purpose might be on Earth, rather than just going through the motions. If anything, Frank Lloyd Wright never went through the motions.
What's the personal tragedy of his life?
Well, he had such a melodramatic life, and he suffered great triumphs and terrible tragedies. The worst thing that happened to him is almost unimaginable and so shocking that it's hard to even talk about, really. He was at the peak of his success in his late 30s, early 40s, married, supposedly happily, 6 kids, this flourishing practice. And he, one day, basically left his wife, ran away, had a passionate love affair with the wife of a client. And they were basically pariahs in his community. He could not come back. He could not work. He was avoided on the street. The ministers denounced him from the pulpit. And he and his lover fled to Wisconsin, where he built this beautiful home, Taliesin. And after they'd been together for about 5 years, he was away working, and she was brutally murdered by a servant who burned the house down.
And as they came out, axed him to death.
He set the house on fire, and when the people tried to get out, including Frank Lloyd Wright's great love of his life, Mamah, and her 2 children, who were, I think, 8 and 10 or something like that, he hacked them to death with an axe. This guy just, from what we know, and there's not much known about it, he just went insane.
And what did that do to Wright?
He was devastated and supposedly thought about killing himself. But he didn't last that long. The truth be told, he bounced back relatively quickly.
Yeah, went back to work.
Went back to work and found a new lust for life. It took him a while, but it didn't ruin his life. It just wasn't in his personality to let even this terrible, terrible tragedy destroy what he felt was his mission, to get his architecture out.
And when he died, he asked to be buried next to her.
Yes, he did, much to the dismay of his then-wife, I think. She was not happy about that, but he wanted to be buried next to Mamah, the woman that he loved who had been murdered, and also near his mother.
The successes of Frank Lloyd Wright are everywhere. At Guggenheim, in this city, in Pennsylvania, Falling Water,
and the
Wisconsin,
synagogue in Philadelphia, Wisconsin, everywhere. Oak Park, in Los Angeles, the textile houses. And then there are really dozens dotted around our landscape. You know, I've come across in my life, before I even knew I was going to do this film, 20 or 30 Frank Lloyd Wrights that suddenly they're sticking up in a suburb of Detroit or in Amherst, Massachusetts, and they're real beacons on the landscape.
Take a look at this clip, more about Frank Lloyd Wright. Here it is.
seems to go on forever. And that's one reason for the low ceiling. So you will associate yourself physically with that horizontal expansion. And the other thing is the color. They're the colors of the harvest. It's golden, green and golden and gentle browns in there. There's nothing like it for a sense of serenity and belonging. Always wonderful autumn in Wright's houses.
That's Vince Scully, the great professor of architecture at Yale, and is an amazing sort of architectural historian, I guess.
He is that, and so much more. I mean, he is responsible for making literally thousands of Americans sort of understand what our built environment's about, and he's so helpful in getting to know Wright, and in that case, Prairie Houses, but also Unity Temple, which he loves in particular.
And Bob Stern, also in your film, is going up to Yale to be the, Dean of the School of Architecture?
The Dean of the School of Architecture.
Architects are an interesting bunch. Most of them have been here.
Yeah, they are. It's pretty amazing. We've had the great pleasure to get to know not only Bob Stern, but Philip Johnson in the course of this. And there is this sense of mission and almost monomaniacal focus and jealousies and concerns and appearances, and out of all of this Sturm and Drang, I think following Wright's example comes.
They're all characters in it. I've never seen a bunch of people more competitive than architects.
Oh my goodness!
If you want to know something bad about an architect, ask another architect.
And you'll get it.
You bet. And Frank Lloyd Wright really was the master of that. He didn't like anybody else.
Didn't even think they were in his league.
No one. No one. There was not another architect. He would compare himself to Michelangelo and Leonardo. Nobody in the last 400 years was worthy to be mentioned in the same sentence.
I was trying to pin Philip Johnson down the other night about who was even close. We know that Frank Lloyd Wright's up there, but who was even close among contemporary architects, present company except, because he's such a great architect himself. He says, I'm not speaking about any of them until they're dead.
Actually, I know who he likes, actually. But the other thing, where did he fail?
As an architect?
Yeah.
That's a great question. I don't know. I don't know enough about architecture. I know that there's the superficial complaint that the roofs leaked, that cantilevers sagged, that all of these things sort of happened to his buildings.
They were more attractive to look at than to live in.
Yeah, and that there was this, definite intelligence that was not only telling you how to live, but to sit in this chair and to have these objects and to, in one case, wear this gown if you were the hostess and these napkin rings. That's not a failing. That's someone who has a world vision. And I think even the drips and the leaky roofs are part of his reaching for something more, as one of our talking heads talks about in the film. I'm sure among his built environment that there are many things that are lesser, that are experiments, but you always have the sense that they're on some kind of continuum and that he's just digesting materials or forms or shape. Someone came to me and said it's all based on a tartan plaid, that everything is, you can go back to some Welsh plaid and it's all there, and you start thinking about it and you go, my goodness, it is. But then in 2 seconds he's gone, that the cactus in Arizona inspired the lily pads of the Johnson wax. It's great.
Late in his career, he was so successful as a very old man, and he built so many houses. And I think at that point, perhaps maybe the quality control, he didn't spend as much attention on every project at that point.
Yeah, but the Guggenheim, one of his great achievements.
He spent a lot of attention on that.
Yeah, and he died, 6 months before it finished?
Just before. It's really, and affords us the coda to our film.
Speaking of the Guggenheim, here's Paul Goldberger, the architectural journalist who writes for the New Yorker magazine, talking about the Guggenheim.
What is all art to do? All art is in some way about some kind of spiritual connection, some connection to something larger than us, some connection to something that we cannot wholly describe or put in words. Art is a lie that tells us the truth, Picasso once said. It's about getting to some feeling. And architecture, unlike any other art, connects to everyday living at the same time. It's a roof over our heads. It protects us from the rain.
That's a great building for showing sculpture.
It is. And, you know, there was so much controversy.
And motorcycles.
People hated it in anticipation of it. Most
Yeah.
of the abstract expressionists were just in outrage that this would be imposed on them, a slanting floor that the building would take away from them.
But it's so amazing because, I mean, it just stands there and you know you're in the presence of a great building.
Yes.
You know?
But I think he was trying to create a space that would be appropriate for sort of contemplation and reflection and make you feel something. The building itself makes you feel something, and then I think he felt you're properly put in the right mood to receive the art. That you can really relate to it in a way differently than you can in a museum where it's just a regular old room.
What's the best thing Frank Lloyd Wright ever said about himself, the most interesting thing about him?
He said, I once had to choose, early in life I had to choose between hypocritical humility and honest arrogance, and I chose
the latter.
The latter, and I just questioned the word honest.
Frank Lloyd Wright airs on PBS November 10th and 11th. Don't miss it. Another terrific piece of work by Ken Burns and Lynn Novick. We'll be right back. Stay with us.